So I'm so happy to be here with you all today with the Rotary Club on World Disability Advocacy. Be talking on inclusive education for blind students, which seems like a very specific and yet very broad topic. So as I was thinking about how to formulate my ideas here, I ended up just having a list here of ideas that I hope to cover. But I'm going to let this kind of go organically, and I hope to take some of your questions if anyone has any near the end. So I imagine many of you don't know who I am and why am I talking on this. I'll give you some background info. I was born and raised in Massachusetts in the United States. In 2001, when I was 5 years old, I got fairly sick and I lost most of my vision. I still have a little bit of vision, but it's not enough to do much. It's enough to kind of navigate a familiar environment, but it's not enough to read print. It's not enough to sit down with a book or take notes with a pen. So it changes how I live in my life. And you can imagine that that has affected my perspective as I've gone through life. So from the very beginning, when I lost my vision, I was homeschooled for a couple of years through third grade. I went into public school. Around fifth grade, I went to private university here in the United States, and I've been working since. But over that course of time, I've had to learn a number of things to simply accomplish the goals that I wanted to accomplish. Things that perhaps someone with no visual impairment would never have to think about. But in going through my education and having to learn all those almost prerequisite skills, I had some interest I wanted to go on to study after university, but I was reflecting upon where I was in my life, and I had learned so much that had allowed me to pursue interests that I had. And I wanted to share that with people who were going through something that I had also gone through, so vision loss. So I applied at the Carroll Center for the Blind, and I've been working there for 5 years now. And over the course of working there, I've worked with hundreds of people with all stages of vision loss, from very minimal sight loss to no sight at all, people who have been born blind, people who lost their vision in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And it's really a very individual experience to lose your vision and then to think about pursuing your goals. So when we look at the word education, I know most of us would think your typical academic education, but there's really a lot more to it than just academics, I think. So let's think about desired outcomes. I always like to start at the end and work my way back when thinking about something so complex as this. What do we want for a blind student? And what does that blind student want for themselves? People are unique. We are all unique. And we cannot prescribe one fixed desire for any group. And that can box people in, and I don't recommend it. There are certain practices we can use for people, but I think the number one thing is empowerment. We want to empower people who are blind, whether they're young, old, to be able to achieve what they want to achieve. And I think it comes down to three things: drive, curiosity, and independence. If we can instill those things, or if those things can be fostered in someone who is blind or visually impaired, they can achieve. Of course, I would like to recognize that I've been fairly fortunate in my position, and people I've worked with here in the United States, to have access to things that people probably don't have everywhere. There's disparities in access in the United States and around the world. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that. So what is the status quo though right now for students? Let's take that academic perspective. I was browsing some statistics this morning, last night, and different organizations will report different statistics, but if we take the blind population in general, they have a much lower graduation rate from high schools than do people without disabilities. Employment rates, the unemployment rate, I think, in the US for people who are blind is between 70 and 80%. The fact that we don't have equal graduation rates, employment rates for people who are blind as opposed to people in the I don't know, quote unquote, general population, tells me that there is not a specific fix. There's ideas, there are things that are working, there are things that are being done well. But since we haven't achieved parity or outright success or a formula that works for everyone, I think we're still in a bit of a creative place for how to address the needs for blind students for inclusive education. And that's where I probably get a little creative about what I think is the right thing for people. And I understand that my perspective is not necessarily the correct perspective, but it's where I'm at in my perspective toward what people need. So what are the prerequisites, I think, for someone who is blind to achieve, to experience the outcomes that they desire? And what do we need to incorporate into education so that that can happen? And I think there's three fundamental things. And the first one is literacy. Literacy, we typically may think of literacy as print literacy, you know, the understanding of a conceptual idea translated into text. And we can read that, we can write it, we can send it, and we can communicate with it. But what does literacy mean for a blind student? It's the same thing. It means processing information, and how that information may be processed. I see it happening in one of two primary ways, either through tactile or sound. So tactile, you'll typically think of as Braille. Braille is very beneficial. I use it, but I learned it young. And people who I've taught it to, the people who learned it when they were children, they are very powerful Braille users. The people who are learning it much later in life, they will typically end up only using it for maybe reading signage on a door, or labeling something around their house. So it's not as beneficial. But I mean, reading a book is great, but reading a book in Braille could take a tremendous amount of time, and you're gonna have a very small pool of people who are blind who can do that. But I think one thing it's really great for is perhaps during presentations, right? Like maybe I'm giving a presentation, I have some talking points, and I can condense those down into very short bullet points. Then I can skim through and read just a word, just another word, and these words represent whole topics. And that's something I try and get a lot of people to understand who are learning Braille, is that you want to get your ideas as condensed as possible, be as sure about what you're talking about as possible, so that you can reference that list of words as you're going. But Braille for the young, I think, would be the gist here. Get it in the hands of children who are blind as young as possible. Braille nowadays, in where I'm located, it's not going to be typically hard copy Braille, so print Braille that is brailled onto paper. That takes a tremendous amount of space, a lot of resources to produce it, where you could get something such as, I don't know if you can see this right here. This is just a Braille display. I'm holding it up. It has a QWERTY keyboard, and it has this little display near the bottom where Braille just pops up. So I could download a book onto here. I could open a website with this, and all the Braille will just pop up here. But Braille is not the only form of literacy, and it's probably not the most popular one. And that's where we come to auditory. And keep in mind, right now when I'm saying blind, I'm talking about people who are probably severely visually impaired. So I will mention people who have slight visual impairments. When we get to auditory, we're talking about speech synthesis. So digital documents, websites, and interacting with those with an assistive technology that will take whatever text is displayed on the screen and speak it aloud. That's another way of processing information. And if you've always been a visual person and you're always reading with your eyes, the idea of consuming large amounts of information auditorily may be it may seem overwhelming, but I think the human brain is a tremendous thing, and it can adapt. And certainly you can adapt to taking in information auditorily, and it is an adjustment. Everything takes time. But it's developing that skill of being able to listen, process information at a rapid pace. So let's say the average person reads 300 words per minute. If we try and take in 300 words per minute auditorily, it's going to be quite quick, and it's going to feel a little strange, perhaps, but it becomes second nature. So literacy, number one, Braille or auditory information processing. Technology is number two. Now, my recommendation for this, for technology, is assuming access, that students have access to technology that can range into the thousands of dollars US. And that's not something everyone can get. It isn't always feasible. And that's another discussion. But if we can set aside that that idea for a minute, that there are some people who just can't get access. If we imagine we are in an ideal world where we can really ensure people have what they need to be successful, technology is definitely there. We live in a globalized world, at least in terms of information sharing, or the potential for true globalization of information sharing. And when information is stored digitally, and we have computers and we have assistive technology that students can use to access that information, they are empowered with not only the knowledge in their own minds, but the knowledge produced by all of humanity forever, at least as far back as we've recorded it. And I think that's really incredible, but it's not easy, perhaps, to use assistive technology. It's not like, for instance, if I take one of my friends who is sighted and I buy them a new computer, and I walk up to them and I say, here's this computer. I want you to tell me how to cook a mac and cheese recipe. This person who is sighted is going to open up this laptop. They're going to type in their thing. They're going to go on the browser, type in recipe, bam, there it is. They're going to read it. And they're telling me in like under 5 minutes, this recipe. Now, if I do the same thing for a friend of mine who is legally blind, and say they're using either magnification software, display enhancement features, or a screen reader, which is the technology that does the speech synthesis to read the text aloud from a page, they can't just open this computer. They have to open the computer. They have to enable their assistive technology. The process for enabling assistive technology may not be accessible. It may not come pre-installed on the device that they're using. So once we overcome that hurdle of even getting it on, they have to know how to interact with the digital content through the operability of their assistive technology. Now, for display enhancement features, for magnification, this could be challenging. It's, I think, arguably easier than using a screen reader, but we can also recognize that disability is not just visual. We may have someone with a slight visual disability who also has a cognitive disability. So using a magnification software, we shouldn't assume that it's straightforward and simple. I think it's a fair assumption to think that there is a good deal of learning that someone who is blind must do to even get to ground zero where they can begin interacting with information online. So I'll perhaps mention a little bit later specific technologies I think people should have, but that's number two, technology. So literacy, technology, and finally, networking. And networking, I don't mean in just the simple sense of having connections, like the digital remote meeting such as this has made it a lot easier, right? I'm sitting here with all of you, we're all talking. I've connected with Ken online. We've never actually met in person, but we've communicated online. And what facilitates me to interact with all of you seamlessly or smoothly? In the digital environment, it's email, it's WhatsApp, it's reading content from different websites, understanding objectives, projects, and being able to communicate. So talking, understanding, writing, these are all fundamental. But if we talk about networking also in the built environment, we add a whole nother spectrum of things that is necessary for the blind student's success. And let's imagine that we're having this meeting in person. We're having it at an unknown location. And let's say I arrive, or someone with a severe visual impairment arrives. All right, where's the door to the building? Which room are we meeting? When we get into that room, how is it set up? Where is everyone sitting? Where is there an open chair? What is the mood of the room? What are the facial expressions of the people in the room? It's difficult, I'd say, for someone who is completely blind to capture all of this information. Not impossible, but difficult. Just to understand the dynamics, the energy of a room. Sometimes you can feel it, it's intuitive, right? But other times there's a lot of visual information that can be taken in by someone at a glance to gain this understanding. And the question is, how is someone who is blind going to do that in a way that's efficient enough for them to gather the information they need to be effective in that setting? So that's the final thing that I'd say is fundamental. Literacy, technology, and networking, digital and in person. So now I think I'll go into some specifics. So if we actually think inclusive education, the topic that we're here to talk about, and let's take the pre-K through 12 framework for this. We can adapt it as we need to, but if we imagine a young child beginning their education, very low vision or no vision, going on through high school, college, what do they need? What kind of supports are they going to receive? What kind of support should they receive? And how are we going to implement that? So again, I have a few categories. I have blindness, academic, social, and occupational. Let's talk about blindness specific. So I'd first like to say that we're talking about how we're going to teach, train, provide inclusive education for the student, but it really is the student who's there first. I don't see education as a top-down thing where we say, here's what you need to know to the student, absorb this and go do something with it. I see it more as, let's fully understand this individual, their capacities, their interests, and let's foster that within them. So when we talk about blindness, we're going to say, here's this individual who is blind. That's the first thing right there. The topic of this thing, I think when it went out, said inclusive education for blind students. And Ken reached out to me and said, is it blind students? Is it students who are blind? And I think a lot of that is semantics, and there is some political correctness that exists today. At my point in my life right now, I don't care. I don't care how I'm referred to. When I was younger, it was very different though. I didn't want to be called a blind student. I was just a student and I happened to be blind. And I think that's an important thing, because if we sit down with a young student who's blind and we say, all right, you're blind, here's what you're going to have to do. What's going on inside that student's mind, they're saying, okay, I'm not who I'm first and foremost, I'm blind. But first and foremost, they're a person. And I think that's really valuable just to point out. So what do they need in terms of blindness supports? Most students here in the US that I've worked with are going to be assigned a teacher of the visually impaired. And depending upon a student's needs, they'll spend a certain amount of time with this person. It could be multiple hours per week, 1 hour per week, 1 hour per month. It depends. But the role of a vision professional or a TVI, teacher of the visually impaired, with a young student, I'd say is to really expose them to things. They're going to teach them things, of course, but perhaps the teacher, they're spending their time learning how to teach, how to do different things, but their expertise will likely not fall into the area of the interests of the student. So they're more of a facilitator than a teacher, I would say, in my perspective, and that's my view. So we want to expose these children to technology, to Braille, to social opportunities. And social opportunities, I think, mean both integrated into a sighted environment where the student perhaps may feel like an other. They may feel like I am the only one in this room who has a disability, but I think that's something people must confront. But it's also socialization with people who are blind, people who they can identify with, people of their own age group, and role models who are perhaps much older than them. It's helpful to see where I'm at my age, where someone else is at my age who's blind, and where someone is at 10, 20 years from now. And I think one thing I've learned through my journey with it is that the perspective does change, the emotions change, the objectives change, and it's a beautiful thing to exist. And it's a beautiful thing to exist and experience a challenge, I think. We learn things about ourselves, we develop a certain fortitude, and I'd love to see that for students. I think that goes back to my idea that I want young students to be empowered. But as we expose children to these things at a young age, they're going to start incorporating they're going to start using their own interests to guide them. Oftentimes you'll see young students really surpass their teachers in terms of their technology skills or their Braille skills quite quickly. And then that teacher, that professional really is a reference point, for guidance. How do I do this? Do you have someone you can connect me with who's done this before so I can learn about that? That's the blindness specific part. It's a facilitator. And that should be part of the inclusive education experience of a blind student. Academic. If a student has strong literacy, technology skills, drive, curiosity, they're going to succeed academically. They may not, but I think there's a very high probability that they do have the potential. But there's some other additional considerations. So in academics, English classes or any language class, literature classes, history classes, these could be things I think that are largely text-based and can be more easy for a student who is blind to kind of slide into. But if we take the sciences, geography, advanced mathematics, we start to get these different visual depictions of information. And that's, again, now we're going to see sighted students be able to glance at something and gain an understanding of something very quickly, whereas the blind student's going to have to find a different way to understand this. This may include someone with sight describing something to them. It may include a alternative presentation of that material. So maybe we take a map of the world and we look at that visually. For a blind student, maybe we turn this into lists. Maybe we have a continent and then a list of all the countries in that continent and a list of all the states or provinces within those countries. And maybe later we get a tactile depiction of the globe, right? So same thing goes not just for geography, but also in science with these different symbols, these models of atoms, and it gets complex. So in that sense, we may need some additional support, but the student is the primary source of information in this context. The student has been being guided for a while in this situation. I think I read on Education by Emile, I think that was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he took this little imaginary student and he started teaching them throughout their life. So essentially, I think I'm doing the same thing here with a blind student. But now they're getting a little bit older and they've been taught some of these fundamental skills, and now they are incorporating them of their own. It's coming from within them. So they can identify, all right, I'm experiencing this struggle. This struggle is similar to a struggle I've experienced in the past. Here's what I've implemented for that issue. I'm going to do the same thing, but alter it in such a way to meet this situation. It's the student's role. Because at the end of the day, when a student has gone through all of their academics, they have finished at least their formal education. We want that student to be empowered to continue lifelong learning. And you don't get that from hand-holding. You don't get that from people doing things for you. You get that from struggling. And it doesn't have to be a struggle, but you get it from just traveling through life in a cognizant and reflective way. So that's blindness, academic, social. We talked about this earlier, but I think it's worth reiterating. Socialization is huge. Whether you're in high school, you're very young, you're in college, you're not even in school anymore, to be blind and to socialize with different people, it really comes down to comfort with yourself, I think. There's no right way to socialize. There's no wrong way to socialize, right? We're all unique, and we interact with each other in different ways. We all see the world in different ways. And the goal for all of us is to be open and accepting of how others exist, to meet people where they're at, to understand them, and to offer them that unbiased just experience of interacting with another person. I think that's wonderful. And for someone to do that, for a blind student to do that in a context, to be confident, to be comfortable, to be relaxed, they need to be intimately familiar with what their limitations are. They need to be honest with themselves. I can do this, I cannot do this. And I think it's important to be comfortable to explain those things to others. I know oftentimes, if before I was getting more comfortable when I was younger and I was going into a setting, I would just pretend that I didn't have visual impairment. And that wasn't to my advantage. It wasn't to the advantage of anyone else around me. It was just me pretending it didn't exist, experiencing struggles. Maybe some people, they couldn't tell. They just thought I was rude. Maybe I bumped into something. Maybe someone thought I was drunk. But when you're, I think at least for me when I was young, it wasn't about, I didn't want to be blind. I just wanted to be normal. And many people, I think, feel that. But socialization can help get us out of that. So, with anything that's a challenge, I think the one thing I always tell myself, always do something. Something leads to something, nothing leads to nothing. So as long as I'm doing something, pushing comfort zones, as long as the blind student is challenging themselves, they're gonna start moving forward and creating momentum to develop into the person that they have the potential to become. Finally is occupational. If I know we're talking about inclusive education, but if we're talking about the outcomes of inclusive education, besides just helping a person to develop into a confident individual where they can experience life to its fullest, it's about outcomes. And it is a fact that we live in a world of money, and we live in a world where people need income to exist. And unfortunately, unemployment rates are extraordinarily high for people who are blind. And actually, the unemployment rates for people who are blind are much higher than the graduation rates for people who are blind, or well, I don't know, higher, lower, however you look at it, it's worse. So maybe many people will graduate high school who are blind, maybe not the entire 100%. Let's just take 70%. 70% of people who graduate high school who are blind will graduate high school. But then only 70% of those people will go on to get jobs. So we're getting this, people are losing something. So I think something exists today in the academic or in the educational system that maybe even if we're passing more people, people aren't getting the skills that they need to be successful. And I think that requires some reflection on what we're implementing into our educational systems for people who are blind. And I haven't conducted a study, but I'm of the opinion that it has to do with self-motivation, independence, and confidence. All right, let me quickly, I have a couple more things I could dive into, but I know I've been talking for a while. Does anyone have any questions? Or
Nick, I question about Braille. Is Braille a universal language?
Braille is not a language. Braille is simply a code. It's just a translation of written language into a different pattern of symbols. It's 6 dots, and you use different combinations of those dots to represent either letters, whole words, or parts of words. And depending upon whichever language it's being translated from, English, Spanish, right, it's going to be different, but Braille is just the code. It's not a language. I know many students I've seen substitute Braille in place of taking a foreign language in school. I don't think it's the same as a foreign language. It is just a code.
So the reason I ask that, if for example, like the project you and I are working on, where we're sending Braille books to other countries, if those Braille books are created in an English-speaking country, and we send it to a Portuguese-speaking country, is that still going to work?
No, because those students are going to be speaking Portuguese. If they are also learning English, they could be used to learn English, but they are all English words. It's not like Braille is separate and somehow above English or Portuguese or equivalent to a language. It depends upon the source language.
Okay, I know it's kind of a naive question, so I apologize for that. But so Braille books can be published in other languages, is basically what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Anybody have any other questions for Nick? Why don't you continue? Oh, go ahead.
Nick, John McFarlane.
Yeah.
You're talking about the unemployment rate or the employment rate. It sounds like it's very similar for the people with visual acuity problems as those with physical problems, in that you get quite a few people graduating, but then the actual employment rate is very high. Unemployment rate is very high. For example, in Europe, those with physical disabilities, the unemployment rate for people who are registered disabled is 75%. So you've got quite a differential. Whereas if you actually looking at the figures, actually since I spoke to you last, the UK unemployment rate across the whole country is 4.5%. The UK unemployment rate for people with disabilities is 59%. So there is a parallel going right the way through. I think some of these problems are actually universal, not just to do with visual, but also to do with intellectual and also with physical, as well as the intellectual side and the visual side.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that comment. It's true. It's much higher, and the question is, why is it so much higher? And I think I can only speculate, but I would speculate that it's more challenging to succeed with a disability that significantly impairs a primary function of the human body, whether that's the mind, the eyes, the ears, mobility. Many people can succeed, however, and we do see it. We see many people with these disabilities really succeed very much. So the question is, what is different about them as opposed to the people who do not succeed with similar conditions? And I do believe, I speculate that it has to do something with a person's ability to do things they do not enjoy, to have some goal that is greater themselves, a life they envision, something that they want, and they're willing to work harder and longer than their counterparts to achieve it. I think it's probably similar to how in the non-disabled population, we have billionaires and we have people making minimum wage. You can talk about privilege and how some people are afforded certain opportunities early on and others are not, and that certainly plays a factor. And it's similar, I think, probably people with disabilities. Some people are afforded opportunities and exposure to things very young that help them achieve, others are not. But you do also see people come from very unprivileged backgrounds succeed. And I think it is about personal drive. And I don't hear a ton of people saying that, but I do think most responsibility in terms of success or outcomes or living the life that you want does depend upon yourself. I think it all goes back to individual responsibility.
I also think, Nick, that we've got a problem with the employers.
Mm-hmm.
We need to educate the employers. It's something that Ken and I have talked about. There is a great deal of ignorance amongst the employers as to what people can and cannot do. And there is an underestimation of people's ability and able to drive. And we've got to educate those employers.
I 100% agree that there is a lot of perceptions out there amongst people who can facilitate paid opportunities for people, thinking that people aren't equipped and capable of doing that. But who is going to advocate for that change? I do think it is, the general population, cultural shifts, also the individual. I've worked with hundreds of people with blindness specifically. And there's a couple of dialogues I hear. Some people will say, it's inaccessible, it doesn't work for me, I'm done. There's people who say it's inaccessible, it doesn't work for me, but I'm going to do this. And to educate employers, I think the person with a disability can do that. But I think it's also important just to walk away, to know when it's not going to work. No one's going to hear you. And unfortunately, that's reality. And I think I like to focus on individual responsibility because it allows me to focus on positives, to frame my world in a more positive way. I don't, at least in my life and my students, I don't know, it is helpful to think about changing the world around you to be better. But I don't think everyone has it in themselves to be an activist. And I don't think being part of a community of people with a similar disability automatically makes people into an advocate. So the question becomes, must we all be advocates? Perhaps the answer is yes, perhaps it's no.
And the other thing, Nick, is that the advocates can certainly help encourage those who are not advocates to stand up for them, their rights. So,
Absolutely.
Nick, we have a couple of hands up. Nilesh is a club member, and he's from India. Nilesh.
Good evening. I have a question. I mean, the question is, how relevant is Braille these days? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. How relevant is Braille these days?
Because, I mean, recently during the pandemic, I mean, there were a lot of people, I mean, I know who are blind, who started using mobile phones. I mean, very cheap ones, like around 7,000-8,000 rupees, that would translate to around a little more than $80. So, I mean, I mean, accessibility of websites makes more sense. I found a lot of young people with, visual impairment or blind are not well versed with Braille. They don't know Braille. Many of them actually do not know Braille. They are more accustomed to using technology. I mean, JAWS and, things like that. So, would it not be more prudent to kind of, concentrate on the new technologies, making it more accessible, making documents like PDF, which are difficult to, I mean, JAWS to, read it through JAWS, make them more accessible. I mean, yes, there will be some places where technology is not really, reached. But I think that is a little myth, because nowadays everywhere you find people with mobile phones. And it's more makes sense to kind of make them more accessible and train people with the newest technology rather than going back, because a lot of people do not know Braille. There are very few Braille teachers also available, I mean, from what I understand. Thank you.
Of course, yeah, thank you for the question. I'd say that to focus on one thing and exclude another, we don't have a finite amount of resources. I mean, I suppose maybe we have a finite number of people on the planet, but I think human cognition, really, I don't think it's finite. So I think we can focus on multiple things at once, and we don't need to just focus on one thing. I do see your perspective, and I do understand that oftentimes people who are blind can more efficiently take in information using a screen reader, can more efficiently navigate a device using a screen reader, meaning keyboard control of a computer, right, to get information. But people who are blind are not the only disability category, and certainly people who are blind aren't just blind in some cases. We have many people who have hearing disabilities, and if we take the deafblind community particularly, Braille will be their primary way of taking in information from digital sources, and oftentimes they'll use a digital Braille display connected to a computer or a smartphone to capture that information. And I think with anything, let's say we have people who are blind and they're not using this all the time. Maybe they use Braille once a week, once a month. And I think that's certainly fine. Focus on what makes you most efficient, increases the value, your value in a way that furthers your objectives. But I think it's helpful for everyone to know a little bit about everything. And I don't think Braille is done. I don't think that we are now in a time when Braille should be relegated to the past. I think it is something we should keep in the consciousness. We should spread awareness. We should find places for it to be used. But again, if we notice we're working with a student who is blind and we notice they're not picking it up and we notice it's a struggle, it's frustrating, I'd keep encouraging them and provide exposure, but I would not allocate an unnecessary amount of time to that. I would say this is not the most productive use of your time. Let's keep it in your repertoire, but let's focus on ways that we can increase your skills exponentially in the shortest amount of time.
Thank you, Nick. And the other thing, of course, too, is what you and I were looking at is that in some of the villages in maybe Africa or maybe India, where there is not technology there, the Braille is still a good tool as long as there's a teacher to teach somebody how to use the Braille.
Absolutely.
So Tom has his hand up. Tom is actually not too far away from you in Drake, Massachusetts. He's a Rotarian. So Tom? Tom, you're on mute. There you go.
Okay. I don't know if you have this or not, but I was thinking you have a student or whatever who's ready to try and go out and get himself employed. Have you considered the possibility of helping him to put together a written resume to send out to employers and be able to conduct interviews like they're interviewing for a job, and you pretend you're the employer and you're asking them questions? Is there any process like that?
Sure.
In the Carroll Center?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the question. We definitely have processes like that in the Carroll Center. I also know that across the U.S., many state agencies for the blind, federally or state funded agencies to help the blind, they also incorporate training such as you're describing there. And I think the term usually used for these are soft skills, resume building, interviewing, writing cover letters. And we certainly do focus on all of that. If you think about where someone might struggle there, it would be, formatting a document to make sure that it looks visually appealing. There may be something you miss. And we, at the Carroll Center, we do teach people how to create and manage digital documents so that they can do that formatting on their own. We also connect them with resources that are available, such as IRA or Be My Eyes, these applications where you can connect with someone through your smartphone and get their input on something that you're working on. Another aspect of working on resumes, interviews, is disclosing your disability. And it's a topic we delve into much. And I think the main piece of advice that we give people is it is ultimately your choice when and how to disclose. I personally will do it right up front. If before I even get an interview, I'll say, this is where I'm at, this is what I have, and this is what I can bring, but this is something that I experience. And if someone accepts that, great. If they don't, I personally, I don't think it's worth my time to try and convince someone of it. If the prospect that I want to pursue or that a student wants to pursue is very important to them, I would say, yes, pursue it, try and convince. Or we might tell someone that may not be a good fit. Other people will choose to not disclose their disability until they're in an interview or until they get the job offer. That's also okay. There's nothing legally wrong with it. I just think it may be a little unfair to the team that you're going to work with to spring something on them like that at the last minute. But I mean, fairness is arbitrary. So yeah, we do focus on things like that in short.
Do you do mock interviews?
Yes, we do
Okay.
that at the Carroll Center. It's a key part of a screen reader user tester training program that I run at the Carroll Center. And it's also integrated into our vocational transition and independent living programs.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Nick. Monique has her hand up. Monique is a club member and she's from Uganda. Monique?
Hey, hi, everyone. I work with 2 children that have sight visual impairments. My concern is the health of the eye. One of the girls, her eye is shrinking. Like you see that over time, she's completely losing the ability to have her eye lobes up. But the other girl, her eyes, you can even think she's able to see. Is there a cause of this eye shrink, even in sight loss? And secondly, I have a friend who is bringing down some white canes for these girls, and she was asking me for specifications. What should we consider? The height of the person? What should be considered when purchasing a white cane for a blind child?
Sure. Thank you for both those questions. I'll take them in the order in which you presented them. The first one, I'm not a medical doctor or anything to do with the eyes, but one comment I do have is that many I don't know what many, but I know in some cases visual conditions can progress, and they can progress rapidly if not intervened. But for some conditions, if intervention happens early, loss of vision can be slowed, stopped, reversed. It's certainly the case that with many visual impairments and conditions that the vision will continue to degrade until it is gone, or at least to a certain point, and then it will be stable. Who knows? But medical intervention or consultation, if it's available, is very important. And I know there's many places in the world where people cannot access the medical care that they need to get attention for the eye conditions that they have, and that it devastates me that someone could lose vision and it's preventable. But we, as a human society, we aren't able in today's age to ensure that that doesn't happen. I think that's incredibly unfortunate. For the cane question, there's pretty much 2 standards. I know in the United States, you'll see people using canes that are roughly their height, and or about maybe mid-chest height. So right above, like where the rib cage meets by a couple inches. And the thinking is, how quickly is this person walking? What kind of environment are they walking in? And what kind of objects do they need to detect? Typically, the faster the person walks, the longer the cane may or should be. So if they're quite a fast walker, you probably want as tall as the person, so that they're going to detect objects as far away from them as possible before they have a possible collision. If you have a slower and much more tentative walker, you may go with a slightly shorter cane about mid-chest, so that they aren't detecting absolutely everything, right? They'll still detect what they need to detect, but it's unlikely that they're going to have an abrupt encounter that could be harmful to them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We're getting towards the end of the hour. I don't know if there's any other questions. One thing I was thinking about, Nick, and I know we're limiting our scope to the United States, kind of, but when a student who is blind goes to public school, and certainly private school too, the school may provide some devices to assist that student. But so then what happens when that student goes to college? And they're basically on their own, is that correct?
it can be the case that a school district in the US would provide technology that is owned by the school district and will have to be returned to the school upon graduation. In Massachusetts, which I think is a good example of how things could be done in other places, when a student is nearing graduation from lower levels, high school, they'll begin to connect with a state vocational agency, and that agency will start saying, what do you need next in your life? And they'll start providing equipment and technology and training on that technology so that the person has things to use after they've left their school district that's been supporting them up until that point. But there are some cases where people do need to go out and purchase their own things and they don't have the financial resources. I know multiple people in Massachusetts who fall into that category. For some reason, they've kind of left the system and now they don't have the resources to get the technology they need to be competitive. And yeah, that does still happen.
Okay, thank you. And there is one more question. It's from Samuel. Samuel's from Haiti. And he's asking, is there an app that convert the writer into voice?
You can turn the writer into voice.
I think he's talking about turning the written word into a verbal word.
Yeah, there's a number of apps. There's one called, and I'm not sure if where these are all available, but there's one that is popular here that I show people. It's called Voice Dream, VoiceDream, Voice Dream Reader, and you can upload any sort of document into that app, and then you can choose specific speech synthesis, technical voices that sound like humans. You can adjust their pitch, their rate, and have it speak out that content. So that's just one example. Other examples would be screen readers that are built into your smartphones, or even one called Seeing AI by Microsoft, where you point your phone at some written text in the actual real environment, and it will capture that and perform OCR and start speaking it aloud.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. We're at the end of the hour. Much appreciated. Diana?
I have a question. First, thank you, Nick, for your insightful presentation today. And would you please send me the link that we talked about on Saturday, please?
Yes, of course. That's on my agenda for today.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you
For the reminder.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you all. Much appreciated. Thank you for coming. And look forward to come back again next time, next month.